Kate. Today we're going to look at close reading a poem. So I'm going to teach you 4 techniques, 4 things to look out for that will help you read a poem, especially a poem you've never seen before, and how to begin thinking about how you might analyse it, think about the meaning, and create an argument around that poem. So today we're going to look at The Hollow Wood by Edward Thomas. Edward Thomas is a poet who's sometimes called the first eco-poet. He was alive at the start of the 20th century, and he actually died in the First World War, although he's usually remembered as more of a nature poet than a war poet. So I'll have a little pause while we read the poem. Brilliant. Now there's 4 things we're going to look out for in this poem. So you can write these down. Number 1 is form. So if I say form, does anyone know what that might mean, or does anybody know of any poetic forms that they've heard of? Yeah, so that's things like a sonnet or an ode or a ballad. So we're going to be thinking about the form of the poem. Second, we're going to be thinking about structure. Now, does anyone have any idea of what I might mean when I say structure? Yeah, so that's things like line length. It's things like stanzas and stanza breaks, and sort of how does the idea take shape in the poem? How does the poet order their thoughts? So we'll be thinking about those things when I talk about structure. Now, third is language. What kind of language is the poet using? Are they drawing on any particular types of words? Are they using very specific language or very vague language? Are they using kind of concrete nouns, or are they using more abstract ideas? So we'll be thinking about that. And then third is device. Poetic devices. Can anybody name any poetic devices? Yeah, so that's things like metaphors, similes. We might be thinking about rhyme or the sounds of words, alliteration, assonance. Brilliant. So those are the 4 things that we're going to be looking out for in this poem. So we'll begin with form. Can anybody tell me the form of this poem? Yeah, so if it's a short poem, it's often a good idea to count the line length, because short poems, sometimes it's a good indicator, if it looks quite squat on the page, that it might be a sonnet. So if we count the lines in this poem, yeah, there's 14 lines. Now 14 lines is an indicator that it's a sonnet. Yes, so you do get different kinds of sonnets with different rhyme schemes. So a Shakespearean sonnet will be split into stanzas, and a Petrarchan sonnet, and with a Shakespearean sonnet you might have, a couplet at the end, and they're sort of particular forms that sonnets can take. But in fact, the only defining factor of a sonnet is that it has 14 lines. Brilliant, so we've got a sonnet. In a while we'll start thinking about the connotations that a sonnet might have, and why the poet might have used the sonnet form in this poem. Second is structure. Can anybody tell me anything about the structure of this poem? Yeah, there's 2 stanzas. Now, how does the poet use this 2 stanza form? It's interesting to think about what's the first idea in the poem. Yeah, so that's the goldfinch. The goldfinch that is out in the sun above the woodland. So we've got this kind of perspective of this goldfinch on the thistle tops above this woodland. That's the sort of the first idea. And then, if we come to the end of the poem, the last idea, we return again to the goldfinch. So we return actually to the moment just before the goldfinch enters the woodland. And in the middle, we sort of take the view from the goldfinch into the wood. So what is in the wood that is beneath the goldfinch? And so the rest of the poem is a sort of a dive into that woodland in the split second before the goldfinch goes there. And it's interesting to think about, or I sometimes think about the stanza break in this poem as the sort of the hollow centre of the wood. So the poem itself is almost like this hollow woodland, and we begin as the goldfinch from the outside, and then we drop in thinking about what's underneath that goldfinch in the wood, and then we come back out just at the moment before the goldfinch enters. So there is a sort of almost, we go from outside to inside, and then in the second stanza, inside to outside. So that's a sort of 2 points that we have there about the structure. So the first, inside to outside, and the second, outside to inside. So we're already getting an idea of how the poet is sort of shaping the ideas in the poem. Language. Can anyone sort of pick up on any particular words that are being used, or any kind of a particular kind of language the poet's using? Yeah, so we have a lot of specific nature words like lichen, ivy, moss, dog's mercury. So we're getting a very particular idea of this place. And now there is something unsettling. Dog's mercury is actually a poisonous weed, and ivy, poison ivy, it's a sort of a creeping plant, and moss and lichen tend to grow in sort of dank, dark conditions. So we're already getting a feel from these kind of concrete nouns, we're already getting a feel for what this place is like. It's dark, it's sort of poisonous, so we can write those sort of specific nature words, and there's something unsettling about those. It sort of creates a dark atmosphere. And device. Now device can sometimes be tied up with language if we're thinking about metaphor, for example. Has anybody spotted any metaphors in this poem? Yep, birds swim like fish, that's a simile. So we can write down, we've got a metaphor. Now, does everybody know how metaphors are structured? What the component parts of a metaphor are? No? Okay, so we'll have, I'm going to use the terms that's used by this critic who wrote about sort of how to analyse poems, and he used the terms tenor and vehicle to talk about poetry. And this is a really useful way of sort of understanding poems. So it's sort of how metaphors work in poems. So he had, if we have one side with the Venn diagram, and then the other, and this is how he, we'll make that a bit better, this is how he kind of thought about metaphor. Yeah, it's not much better, is it? So tenor and vehicle, it might be useful to write this down. So the tenor in the poem is the thing being described. So in this instance, we've got the birds. The tenor would be birds, because it's the birds are the subject of the metaphor. And then vehicle is the other word that's being brought into the poem to help us describe the tenor. So that's fish. The birds are like fish. Now in the centre are all the shared qualities that these kind of two objects share. And then we have outside the things that they don't share, we call tension. So tension are the things that they don't have in common, and then here we have the shared qualities. Yep, so they're both animals. Yeah, but other than that, there aren't many similarities, and in fact, it seems more of a confusing or upsetting metaphor, perhaps, than a sort of an elucidating one. And I think that's really what the poet is after here. They're almost too similar. There's not enough tension in that they're both from the animal kingdom. There almost seems to be a sort of something glitching going on here. The birds being like fish, they're almost too similar because they're from this sort of same category of object or of being. and then, but within that, they're almost sort of, they're just two different things, and one doesn't help us think about the other in a new way, other than to sort of create an unsettling effect. Birds aren't fish, and fish aren't birds, and so there seems to be in this hollow wood a sort of surreal, slightly unnatural thing going on. There's something strange going on in this place. So the metaphor and the balance of how the tenor relates to the vehicle can help us understand and locate what the poet is doing and how the poet is creating a sort of an effect of strangeness. So the metaphor is strange, surreal, perhaps even unnatural. The birds sort of swimming like fish, that's not normal, birds to swim. So we'll pop that there. So we can sort of see how the poem begins to take shape. Now, next time we can talk about how we're going to use form, structure, language and device to begin to structure an argument and an essay about this poem.